Humans began like other creatures. Their basic energy was sunlight, captured by plants and turned into food. The first energy revolution happened when they harnessed animal power to the plow. Then they used the force of water and wind to grind their daily bread. But labor-saving methods are addictive once people depend on them. Without them, they starve. And as our civilization became more complex, it found a new addiction to coal. Coal created steam and steel, and together they built the industrial Europe of the 19th century. The population increased, cities grew, machine power became a necessity. But unlike water power and horsepower, coal can run out. So can the great energy source of the 20th century, oil. Both are fossil fuels which stored the energy received from the sun millions of years ago. By burning them, we are changing the energy balance of our planet. By night as well as by day, it's oil that feeds us. Is it any wonder that we go to war to maintain our oil and food supplies? In 1956, the Suez Crisis had shown up Western Europe's embarrassing reliance on energy supplies from abroad. With the canal closed, a supertanker was born to carry oil around Africa. But the crisis passed, and many new oil sources were discovered, especially in Libya and Nigeria. So the price of oil fell.
Terminal, boy 2 calling. Come in, please, over.
We are all set.
Energy costs in general fell from 1957 to 73, but by then, Western Europe was importing 2/3 of its fuel as foreign oil and coal. Any government doubts as to whether this was wise were washed away by a flood of cheap oil. It brought great benefits. Industry boomed. And in the West, the standard of living rose rapidly, creating a new society of consumers. They bought machines which would save human energy, but used more fossil fuels. Electricity made from coal and gasoline. Next to growing food, making cars. The Soviet Union neglected the consumer, but became a superpower by concentrating its resources and best minds on an arms race with America, and on the prestige of putting the first man into space. Watching the weapons of mass destruction, beside Khrushchev stood Yuri Gagarin, who in 1961 became the first man to leave the Earth, making the most symbolic journey since our ancestors had learned to walk upright. The East had stung the West into fierce competition. But the huge natural resources of the Soviet Union were still devoted to the Marxist principles of strategic self-sufficiency in food and energy. During the Second World War, large new oil fields had been found in the Volga Basin. When this natural wealth began to flow, it astonished the local Tatars. But Khrushchev was not so naive. He realized that energy, especially oil, could be used for political ends. He had the Friendship Pipeline built to pump oil from the new oil field to the Soviet states of Eastern Europe. The Friendship Pipeline stretched from Kuibyschew, a distance of 1,500 miles, to Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany. By exporting half its oil to the communist Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union made its neighbors dependent on its energy. Moscow gained control over their industry. Soviet oil was bartered for machinery and manufactured goods, especially consumer products that Soviet factories were unable to produce. The countries with coal fields, especially Poland and Czechoslovakia, now provided the industry not just for Eastern Europe, but the Soviet Union as well. But the communist leaders set up their heavy industry like steel making, not where it was logical, where coal and iron were close together, but on the strict Marxist principles of sharing manual labor between the countryside and the cities to make sure that the hammer joined the sickle. Western reliance on free competition brought other problems. The coal industry was in crisis because a third of Europe's fuel was now cheap foreign oil. For the first time since the Industrial Revolution, the production of coal was actually falling. Huge stocks remained unsold at the pitheads. Half the miners in the Ruhr lost their jobs, and in 1962, the French government decided to convert all its power stations from coal to oil. Across Western Europe, the miners were on the streets. By 1967, even modern mines were being closed in Belgium. To help the police maintain order, paratroops were called in. In the riots at Limburg, which lasted 3 days, 2 miners died. Nevertheless, though oil might be cheap, oil was not secure. In 1967, Israel brought conflict to the Middle East by capturing the Suez Canal, the Six-Day War. In October 1973, the Egyptians and Syrians, armed by the Soviet Union, attacked the Israeli-held territories, the Yom Kippur War. Israel struck back, supported by an American airlift of arms. The Egyptians successfully regained the Sinai Desert and the Suez Canal. The Arabs were furious at the way the West supported Israel, and the Arab oil-producing countries retaliated by cutting back oil production 5% a month in an attempt to force Israel to withdraw to its 1967 frontiers. Oil sales were completely banned to the United States. In the chaos which followed this OPEC crisis, oil prices quadrupled. Oil by then provided 2/3 of Western Europe's energy, and 2/3 of that came from the Middle East. European governments were forced to cut consumption of fuel oil and gas. For example, in Holland, driving on Sunday was banned. The huge change in the cost of oil caught governments unprepared, and they suddenly had recession and massive balance of payment problems. The choices for alternative energy had been made eons ago by a collision of continents. It left folded rocks in the heart of Western and Eastern Europe, some of them lifted up again as the Alps were formed. These contained uranium, a fuel of almost magical power that promised in its early days to release the world from its addiction to coal, and especially from oil from the Middle East. The French government decided that uranium would provide their salvation. 39% of their electricity was generated then by burning oil, and they had been badly hit by the quadrupling of the oil price. The greatness of France had sprung from agricultural wealth, born from the soils of limestone rocks. Now, to regain control of its destiny, France was to put all its eggs in the nuclear basket, planning to build 66 billion watts of generating capacity to supply over 80% of France's electricity by 1990. Nuclear power stations are expensive to build, but are massively powerful. It was cheaper to use uranium than enormous amounts of fossil fuels. The high price of oil, plus the security promised by home-generated power, made nuclear reactors seem a safe bet. Britain decided to build 39, and the Germans a similar number. Europe was going nuclear. On the edge of the same ancient mountains that held uranium, the European coal fields had been formed. But despite government subsidy, they were now increasingly uneconomic. The reason, once again, was geological. Many of the mines were deep. The coal seams had been buried and broken up when the Alps were formed. Coal was difficult to find, difficult to mine. It was expensive to pump the mines dry and to bring the coal to the surface. And the same geological processes that had given us coal now yield another new competitor for it. Almost every European town had a gas works where coal was made into coal gas. At Groningen in 1956, an enormous field of natural gas had been found, and the Dutch began to use this new fossil fuel to replace coal gas. It meant that every single gas appliance in the country had to be converted to burn natural gas, but it was worth it because the gas was so cheap. This conversion was to happen all over Europe during the 1960s, but as each flame of natural gas took hold, the coal industry lost a customer. The new pipelines were for natural gas. They were not just to bring it to cities, but to export it as well. So great is the value of energy that this single gas field helped to make the Netherlands one of the most prosperous countries in Europe. Today, 3/4 of the energy used in British homes is natural gas. Once again, the complex geological history of Europe offered an opportunity to its people. The oil fields of the Middle East had been formed beneath tropical seas 180 million years ago. But precisely the same geological formations occurred beneath northern Europe. Perhaps they too would hold oil, but they were far harder to explore because they lay under a stormy sea. Gas is formed in the same way as coal and oil from the plant life of early oceans. After the discovery of natural gas on land in the Netherlands, it was not long before drilling rigs were probing the bed of the North Sea. Despite the severity of conditions, the huge cost, and the technical difficulty, the potential rewards were great. And in 1965, the gamble paid off. The gas at Groningen and under the North Sea was actually related to the coal fields. But the real prize was oil, and exploration spread into the deeper waters farther north. By 1974, a year after the OPEC crisis, 18 oil fields had been found in the Norwegian and British sectors of the North Sea, thanks to good timing, luck, and massive investment. With the price of oil quadrupled, it paid to get it ashore. and the first North Sea oil was piped from the Norwegian sector, not to Norway, but to Britain, in June 1975. This new mineral wealth was not confined to Western Europe. Vast new oil fields had also been found in Siberia. The Soviet Union had a special need to sell oil, to buy grain from the United States because Soviet agriculture was so inefficient. So the Soviet economy, too, began to depend on the oil price. The more it cost, the more worthwhile the effort to find it quickly. It was a timely discovery because the Volga-Urals oil field had been pumped almost dry. The new fields were at Tyumen, just east of the Ural Mountains in Siberia, but they were over 1,200 miles from Moscow. Still, they were the biggest outside the Gulf, and a vast construction project began to pipe the oil to where it could be sold. Then, once again, the world's oil supply was thrown into chaos by instability in the Middle East. In 1979, Iran was in turmoil following the overthrow of the Shah. And the dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, took the opportunity to try to seize the Iranian oil fields. The war between Iran and Iraq and the destruction of major oil terminals like Abadan forced up the oil price by 250%. While the Gulf burned, oil prices rose. They had risen tenfold in the 70s. Because the world's economy survived on oil, world trade plunged into a severe recession as it had after the OPEC crisis. The combination of recession and high prices cut oil demand, while the North Sea replaced the Middle East as the biggest supplier of Europe's oil. By 1985, EEC countries had halved their imports from OPEC. The OPEC price cartel collapsed, and in '86, the oil price tumbled from $30 a barrel to only $14. And when oil is cheap, it hurts coal. With cheap oil and foreign competition, the coal price fell by 2/3, and the traditional deep mines could not compete. Despite a 50% increase in productivity, the less economic mines were closed. Less than 1/3 of the coal burnt by British Steel now came from British pits. Europe bought cheap energy at a heavy social cost. The 1985 British coal strike lasted over a year. In Eastern Europe, oil had produced a social crisis in a different way. In countries like Poland, the standard of living fell and labor unrest broke out because governments had borrowed heavily from the rich Arab oil states but had failed to invest in their own mines and industries, crippling their economies. United by Catholicism, the Poles dared to believe in something better than their communist rulers. The fall in oil price seriously damaged the Soviet Union. No less than 90% of Soviet exports in 1984 were minerals, mostly oil. Hard currency was desperately needed to buy grain. But the harsh conditions of Siberia and the huge distances that Soviet oil had to be piped meant high production costs. The inefficient Soviet economy was squeezed between increased costs and low oil prices, and it brought about the need for restructuring Soviet industry. General Secretary Gorbachev's new doctrine of perestroika. The low oil price was one reason why the Soviets could no longer afford to spend so much on arms. Gorbachev negotiated arms reduction treaties with the West. Communism had sought a workers' paradise through industrialization, but now Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, openness, for the first time allowed workers to complain, and it was revealed that the Marxist dreams were bankrupt. Communist industry had poisoned the very people it was supposed to benefit, the workers. Industrial pollution was far worse than in the West. The Soviet Union has the greatest iron and steel production of any country in the world, but it was achieved at the cost of its people. With their industrial economies crumbling, the whole communist empire began to fall apart. Poland had a foreign debt of $40 billion and a bankrupt industry which generates 10 to 20 times the pollution of comparable Western plants. Because of pollution, 1/3 of the Polish population now lives in areas officially designated as uninhabitable. Then, in 1986, the reactor at Chernobyl exploded. The Soviet Union had rushed through a big nuclear energy program to generate electricity, enabling more oil and gas to be exported to earn foreign exchange. The Chernobyl accident finally extinguished the promise that uranium would be the panacea for the energy needs of the human race. The nagging suspicion that the public had always had about the connection between nuclear power, nuclear explosions, and the escape of radiation had come horribly true. Around the world, politicians sensed the public mood of anger and distrust. And even in the Soviet Union, new reactors were canceled. Also, as the huge capital cost, disposal cost, and decommissioning costs were added up properly for the first time, nuclear power began to frighten the accountants. Still, at the end of the 1980s, Europe relied heavily on nuclear power. No less than half of the world's reactors were in Europe. But many were being shut down due to a combination of age, lack of public confidence, glasnost, and new democratic freedoms in Eastern Europe. Unlike the rest of Europe, France, however, was going ahead with its nuclear program.
Dans la vie, il y a 1000 manières d'affirmer sa personnalité. 1000 signes distinctifs. 1000 façons d'être différent.
The French National Electric Company, EDF, kept on smiling and carried on building nuclear reactors. EDF still has the world's biggest nuclear program.
EDF, la parole est au sourire.
But, along with concrete sheep, EDF now has one of the biggest commercial debts in the world, 226 billion francs. In 1990, it made only a tiny profit. The giant French nuclear program accounted for about a quarter of the entire country's industrial output and could not be abandoned without causing massive unemployment. So, the French decided to generate and sell as much nuclear electricity as possible. It is now the turn of gas. Previously, when gas was found with oil, it was just flared, an appalling waste of valuable energy. The reason for switching fuels is almost always based on cost, and coal-fired power stations, like this one in Britain, began to be converted to gas. Natural gas already provides a fifth of the world's energy. Environmentally, gas is a more friendly fuel than coal. When it's burned, it releases 40% less carbon dioxide. So switching to gas from coal causes less global warming. But that's not why it's being used. It's because it's cheaper. Gas power stations can be built in only 2 years, compared to 14 for a nuclear power plant, and can pay off their construction costs in only 5 years. In the 1980s, a third of the world's gas reserves were found in the Yamal Peninsula of western Siberia. Already 1,400 wells have been drilled there, but the gas must be piped an enormous distance, 2,200 miles, to populated areas. Only half the gas that enters the pipeline in Siberia arrives at the other end. Large quantities of gas have to be burnt just to pump it. And they have the worst safety record in the world. 4 accidents for every 600 miles every year. A major break every 2 weeks. Just such a leak blew up 2 trains full of school children in June 1989. Soviet energy supplies were also threatened when the freedom of glasnost led to protest. The increasing dissatisfaction of ethnic communities in Azerbaijan in 1990 came close to open rebellion and civil war. Their wish for national recognition had a double significance. When they burnt their Soviet identity cards, they threatened Soviet oil, because Azerbaijan was the home of the Soviet oil industry, and that was too much. Russian troops were drawn in. Many of the workers on the production sites in Siberia came from Azerbaijan. They now left their jobs to go home, further endangering the supplies of Soviet oil and gas. In 1989, economic weakness led to political collapse. The communist governments of Eastern Europe had begun to fall. First, the Poles rid themselves of their hated past. Mass protests by the people of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria swept away the heritage of Lenin. In fact, it was television that showed the power of the people back to themselves and spread the revolt. The ordinary Soviet citizen might approve of the new political openness of glasnost, but perestroika had been a disaster. The problem with communism was not just that it was tyrannical, but that it was inefficient. Now it was failing even to get food into the shops. Not long after this, rationing was brought in. After decades of prices fixed by the state, inflation began to be a serious problem. There was talk of famine. Despite its huge energy reserves and its massive economy, the Soviet system could not even make enough sausages. In November 1989, in East Berlin, the communist rulers gave in. The hated Berlin Wall came under attack. With the euphoria of freedom and the reunification of Germany came optimism that the new democracies in Central Europe would begin a new era of peace and cooperation between East and West. With the rising political influence of environmentalists, there were hopes that the West, prospering on cheap oil, would help rebuild the industry of Central Europe for an ecologically sustainable future. But even as the most hated symbol of the Iron Curtain was being demolished, once again a short-term energy crisis changed the political agenda. Again, Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, caused the oil price to jump from $16 a barrel in July 1990 to a peak of $42 in October. He had invaded Kuwait and showed that the only thing you can rely on about the Middle East is its insecurity. It was not so much the seizure of Kuwait that drove up the oil price, but what Saddam Hussein might do next. A quarter of the world's oil reserves are in Saudi Arabia, next door to Kuwait. No industrial country could afford to let its energy supply be threatened. So, to prevent Saddam Hussein gaining a stranglehold on the world's oil, the United States led a coalition of 37 countries to defend Saudi Arabia and free Kuwait. The United States gets a quarter of its oil from the Middle East, but had to appeal to its industrial competitors in Europe and Japan, whose oil supplies were also being defended, to help foot the bill. While the West was preoccupied, Moscow showed it was still the master of the Baltic. These tanks were sent in to check Lithuania's bid for independence and stop the Soviet Union from disintegrating. Even when Moscow had cut off Lithuania's oil supplies, it had not been enough to stem the rising tide of nationalism. The political consensus had gone. The Soviet monolith was only being held together by force. In the meantime, Saddam Hussein had ignored the United Nations resolution demanding that he leave Kuwait, and in mid-February 1991, Allied bombers took off to target Iraq. Human ingenuity had devised a new kind of warfare with microchips. The same electronic revolution made the whole world a witness. And the whole energy infrastructure of electricity supplies, communications, and services that made Baghdad a modern city was systematically destroyed. In 1991, Latvia, like Lithuania, was pressing its claim to be independent of the Soviet Union. More martyrs fell in the snow. There had been more shooting by Russian troops as they stormed the headquarters of the Latvian police who supported the population. This time among the casualties were a television crew. Cameramen were the eyes of the world. Moscow wanted them closed. The Gulf War was now reaching its grisly climax with the saturation bombing of Iraqi troops, followed by the invasion of Kuwait and southern Iraq. The The military goal of forcing Saddam Hussein to withdraw was quickly achieved, but two 20th century cities, Kuwait and Baghdad, had been cut off from their most basic requirement, energy. The human horrors of the occupation of Kuwait, the war, the civil war in Iraq, the grim fate of the Kurds, were paralleled by the unique ecological vandalism of Saddam Hussein in releasing oil into the Gulf and then setting fire to over 500 Kuwaiti oil wells, bringing a whole new meaning to the phrase scorched earth. But this didn't bother the oil markets. Ever since Suez, the main influence on the oil price had been conflict in the Middle East. First, the Yom Kippur War. Then the Iran-Iraq War. Then the invasion of Kuwait. Previously, economic recession and the discovery of new reserves had brought the price down again. This time, the price came down because the merchants knew that the spectacle of 6 million barrels of oil a day going up in flames was, in the eyes of conventional economics, insignificant. The amount of oil being burnt here was only 1/10 the oil that the world burns every day in its machines. That is the real crisis, that our civilization has become a hostage to burning oil. Our whole way of life is based on the consumption of ever-increasing amounts of fossil fuel. And burning fossil fuel releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, causing global warming. Throughout history, the progress of civilization has depended on learning to exploit ever more of the Earth's resources. But at the end of the second millennium, we have reached an extraordinary turning point in the story of European civilization. Addiction to energy is changing not just the continent, but the entire planet. The only way to stop global warming is to use less coal, oil, gas, and this, brown coal or lignite. This giant lignite mine near Cologne was only started in 1978. Before that, it was level fields. It is one of 4 that supply the fuel for 1/4 of West Germany's electricity. Every day, this single bucket wheel eats up 350,000 tons of the countryside. Americans and West Germans use more energy each than anyone else. It is a perilous addiction. This modern German power station has only 2 days' supplies of lignite in reserve. Those buckets must keep turning.
Aufstehen. Komm.
Achim Koch is a typical German worker. He lives in a house near Bonn. He is the foreman of a garage for the National Border Guard. Germany's frontiers have just changed dramatically, and now Easterners want the same standard of living as in the West. Suzanne and Achim have 3 children. The way they live is not exactly ostentatious. But somehow those gadgets that yesterday were labor-saving luxuries now seem necessities. A third of all the energy used in Germany is used by families.
Bist ein großer Junge. Kein Fläschchen. Mama. Ja, versuch mal. Pass mal auf, tu mal das Fläschchen weg. So. Hm? Spatzel. No, iss mal. Iss mal dein Brötchen auf.
If the capitalist system has led us to the brink of destroying our environment in the West, so has the Marxist system in the East. Communist countries waste far more energy in industry. They use 2 to 3 times as much energy to make a ton of steel as European countries. They have the energy waste without the affluence. Ironically, there are many aspects of family life in the East that are less energy wasteful. In the West, only a third of the coal burnt in a power station is made into electricity. The rest of the heat goes up the cooling towers. Soviet power stations are near blocks of apartment buildings so that they can use the energy we would waste for heating and hot water. A typical apartment in the outskirts of Moscow may seem primitive to us. Mrs. Rezhniak has fewer electrical devices, using energy to save her labor. With 2 sons, she uses only a fifth as much electricity as a German family. One reason is the family apartment is only a third the size of a German one. But there are no thermostats on the radiators. To make the apartment cooler, you have to open the window and let heat energy escape.
Ты уже подготовил все вещи?
The older generation are used to it, but the young, like Dennis, have one dream: to live like the West. They have only 1/10 the number of cars that West Germans have. Russians and East Europeans want a Western lifestyle. But the more people that follow the West's example, the worse the energy crisis will become. Western Europe contributes 15% of the world's carbon dioxide. Eastern Europe, 24% for a much smaller production of goods. So making Eastern Europe more energy efficient is, in fact, one of the cheapest ways of slowing global warming. With the rebirth of Europe as a continent no longer divided by the Iron Curtain, an enormous opportunity exists for Western Europe to help Eastern Europe to rebuild an ecologically sound, energy-efficient society for the future. It is the challenge that faces Americans as well. One way of paying for the enormous restructuring of Eastern and Western industries is to spend less on making arms. There seems a real possibility that this could happen with the end of the Cold War, but only given political stability. It's already happening. This factory in Russia used to make parts of missiles. Now it makes children's bikes. Turning swords into bicycles has more than a symbolic significance. A bicycle is a more efficient way of moving a human being than walking. This is the way to use human ingenuity. If it can be directed so that renewable sources can make up a large proportion of our needs, it would also reduce the threat of more wars about oil. Cities like Rome have already discovered that they have to restrict individual freedoms to make life tolerable. Cars are banned from the city center. It is a taste of what is to come if we are going to control not just vehicles, but our whole addictive use of energy. Since humans first arrived to hunt on this land 35,000 years ago, many cultures, many civilizations have flourished and collapsed. The challenge is now to avoid the next collapse. In the past, the geology of Europe had always held a new source of energy from which the fire of civilization could be rekindled. Is there another? Or do we have to look to ourselves for the solution? History makes clear how we have come to this crisis. The technology exists to solve it, but is there the will? Do we and the politicians have the humility to recognize in the Latin verse of our title song, "We are but numbers, fit only to eat the fruits of the earth"?